Om Stapakaya Chitarmasya Sarvadharma Swarupine Avatara Varishtaya Ramakrishnaya Te Namaha. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahanau Punuktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Astuma Vidvishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. O Lord, Ramakrishna, establisher of the religious ideals universally accepted and the embodiment of every single religion, to Thee, the noblest of divine incarnations, we offer our salutations. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May our study be full of vigor and strength and illumination and excellence. May we not unnecessarily quarrel with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So, today we are celebrating the Tithi Puja of Swami Saradananda, direct disciple, one of 16, of that great mystic, Sri Ramakrishna. We can think of Ramakrishna as an incomparable light, something like a burning fire, from which a number of lamps are lit, and we honor 16 apostles that are offshoots, as it were, from that lamp. And somehow I'd like to think that the 16 apostles are like the 16 annas that Sri Ramakrishna mentions. I've practiced all the 16 annas referring to the monetary divisions. And you need only practice one or two. And so that whole concept comes to my mind when I think of these great lamps lit from this one great fire. So the Bhagavad Gita tells us about somebody who is of steady wisdom. So it's in response to a question in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, which asks, what is the mark of somebody who has steady wisdom, what we call sthita prajna? And how can we recognize such a person? How do they speak? How do they conduct themselves? How do they sit even? How do they walk? Things like this. And when we celebrate the lives of these great saints, we're also curious to know, how does a person speak? How do they conduct themselves, particularly in times of crisis? Everybody can conduct themselves with great reasonable decor when things are going smoothly. But when our boat gets rocked and thrown here and there, how do we behave? And so two other stanzas are there because Krishna replies to this question, how does a man of steady wisdom look? And he says, when a person, prajahati yata kaman salvan partha manogatam achamani eva tvana tustaha sthita prajnas tadochiti. When a person completely throws off, casts away all the desires of the heart, the self being satisfied in the self alone, then he's said to be one of steady wisdom. Our difficulty in life is that we are pulled by this and that, here and there, and don't think that desires are for objects, or in the realm of career, or these tangible things, or tangible events. If you ask somebody the question, if you have unlimited resources, then what will you do with it? Supposing you go and win the lottery, then what will you do with it? It can give you even a choice of 3 things. And I think most people will identify something that fulfills some kind of fantasy, some kind of desire, which indicates a dissatisfaction in the mind. I wish I was more like this. I wish I had that. But the desires for objects comes from a more subtle desire in the mind. It can be a desire to feel rewarded, a desire to feel loved, a desire to feel appreciated. In short, a desire for a settlement in the mind where nothing gets unusually disrupted. Peace. And so we hold peace up as a great ideal. We hold peace up as something that is necessary more today, and it's quite true. When we look at the world of international affairs, we find things are far from being peaceful. And yet, every person, no doubt, goes to sleep, and in that sleep, we find a peace. Some people want to blank that out deliberately and consciously do that. Some people take substances, for example, that will blank off the mind completely. But when they get out of that, of course, the trouble still remains. It's not a solution in any way, shape, or form. He whose mind is not perturbed by adversity, imagine, who does not look for happiness, who is free from passion, who is free from fear and anger, that is the sage, that is the one of steady wisdom. So we are in a condition whereby any slight adversity or anything that somebody says, we are ready for drastic measures. I like to open my ears because I hear praise. But as soon as I hear an element of criticism, then it wounds me to the heart and I'm ready for suicide. Imagine. I'm all right as long as conditions are all right. And so this continuous search for happiness is equivalent to the search for peace. How does this relate to Swami Saradananda? He was a man who absolutely echoed this whole concept, this whole ideal of steady wisdom in the midst of all kinds of adversaries. I have three examples for you in his life. And I'm referring to a book, Apostles of Ramakrishna. It later is published as Disciples of Ramakrishna, incorporating others beyond the scope of monastic disciples. As you know, Swami Saradananda really has two dimensions of his life. One is the spiritual dimension, him as a spiritual person, and an ideal at that. And on the other side, as a very efficient secretary of that movement that turned out to be Ramakrishna Math and Mission. It began off as a Ramakrishna Mission Association. Swami Vivekananda organized it when he came back from India. And he did that 1898 when he reached when he came back, but soon after his arrival, or soon after 1898 is when Swami Saradananda had come back from a visit to the West. He spent 2 years in the West. And he was called across to assist Swami Vivekananda, initially in London, and thereafter in America. And after the Parliament of Religions, there was a great conference, a great movement that organized a Green Acre Conference in Massachusetts. And this Green Acre Conference had many, many prominent speakers, including a Dr. Paul Karras, who made many studies of Christianity and Buddhism. And Swami Vivekananda was one of the initial guests and speakers. Swami Saradananda also was one of those. But after 2 years there, in 1898, he came back. And he immediately was asked to take over as secretary of the Ramakrishna Math and Mission. And that's an office he held to the end of his days. Of course, the first president of the movement, of the order, was Swami Brahmananda. But on Swami Brahmananda's demise, Swami Saradananda was asked to take over as president, but he declined because he said, Swamiji, that is Swami Vivekananda, had asked me to be the secretary. And so, loyal to him, I will always be the secretary. I will come back to how Narendra or Naran, later becoming Swami Vivekananda, and Swami Saradananda, met as young teenagers or in their early 20s. But soon after this, after a few months there, Swami Saradananda started for Kashmir because he had heard from Swami Vivekananda that he was ill. Swami Vivekananda was ill there. And so on the way, Swami Saradananda met with an accident. It was between Rawalpindi and Srinagar that the horse of the coach, which he was traveling in, suddenly took fright and bolted down the hill. And the coach had gone some way down and it struck a tree, and the whole thing was overturned, or it was an accident. But there was still an opportunity to get out, which he did. And just then a boulder fell from above and crushed the horse to death, but left the Swami intact. But you see, that's not just the end of it, because what was Swami Saradananda's reaction? More surprising was that Swami Saradananda, he didn't lose his equanimity even in that critical hour. There's another incident that he was in the middle of a cyclone in the Mediterranean on his voyage to London, and everybody in the ship was restless, running up and down in despair of their life. And many gave vent to their fear in cries. You know how it is. You can imagine something like the Titanic. But Swami Saradananda was the silent spectator of the whole scene. On another occasion, he was on the Ganga in a country boat on his way from Kolkata to Belur. And there was a devotee accompanying him. And as I recall from some other story that was related to that it was actually a doctor friend of his. Anyway, a severe gale rose up in the Ganga River, and the boat, you know, the small boats, there's not a huge boat, these small boats, fishing boats as it were being tossed about in the midst of dashing waves. But Swami Saradananda was calmly smoking a hookah. And this composure so exasperated the devotee that he took the pipe and threw it into the Ganga. And to this fury of the devotee, he said, "Are you not worried, you know?" And the Swami just sat there and smiled. And I think from another relation of the story that he said, well, look, when we wind up in the water, then we'll start worrying about it. So the epitome of coolness, and as I say, the whole ideal of the Sthita Prajna, the steady wisdom. The meeting with Naran, of course, followed his own meeting with the master, Ramakrishna. Of course, he was brought up in a household of strict Brahmins, a wealthy family. And he, as a child, had certain qualities which were obviously of a saintly type. There are some stories from this book that start off like that, mentioning that he came from a rich and orthodox Brahmin family, and his uncle, Sharat Chandra, was an expert in astrology because he was born on a Saturday, and that's not seen to be very auspicious. But his uncle assured him, no, that this person would be somebody who is great and would shed luster on the family. And so from his boyhood, Sharat was a very quiet young boy. And this could, of course, be mistaken for dullness, but actually intellectually he was brilliant. He soon showed his extraordinary intelligence in class works, and in almost all the examinations, he topped the list of successful boys. He took great delight also in extra curriculum activities because he enjoyed those, and he became a prominent figure in such things as debating class. And we find later how he was a very good speaker. And he also had a very strong physique, developed through physical exercise, and attracted some notice. Those people who are on the Vedanta Society chat group will see a remarkable photo of this Swami in his youth, a striking face. His deep religious nature expressed itself even in his early boyhood, and he would sit quietly by the side of his mother when she was engaged in worshipping the family deity, and afterwards would faultlessly repeat the ritual before his very friends. Even on festive occasions, he would want images of deities and not the mere small dolls and things which average lads buy. And for a long time, the play which interested him most was to perform imitation worship. So he was very courteous by nature, a gentle soul that lasted throughout his whole life because he had a certain presence. Jesus said, blessed are the pure, blessed are the peacemakers. And you see, he was one of those type, spreading and radiating peace and calmness wherever he went. He was really incapable of using any harsh word to anybody or of hurting anyone's feelings in any way. And from the very youth, it was evident that he had a very soft feeling heart and lost no opportunities to help poor people, such as even his poor class friends, giving them whatever small money he had that was given, kind of pocket money for tiffin, away to those boys. And sometimes even giving away his own personal clothing to those who needed them. Relations and friends, acquaintances, neighbors, servants, housemaids, whoever fell ill, he was there. He was sure to be by their side. Once there was a maidservant in a neighboring quarter, and she fell ill of cholera, and the household put her in a small corner to prevent any infection spreading, and left her there actually to die. And it was Sharat who rushed to the spot, and all alone, he did everything to assist this poor person. Despite that, she died, but he was devoted to service from a very, very young. So these are some of the qualities that build the foundation now for this great, great saint, Saradananda. He managed to pass the university entrance exams from the Hare School, and the next year he got himself admitted to St. Xavier's College, and there was a certain priest there, a Jesuit priest, Father Lafront. Now, many people, many of those talented students went to these schools that were run by Roman Catholic Jesuits. Even Pope Francis today is a Jesuit. It means they belong to a certain monastic order. And so I also had my higher education from these people. I mentioned to the local priest here in our area, and he said, therein lies the difficulty, because they were known to be radical thinkers, intelligent people, doing 14 years academic training before being ordained. And so Father Lafront was the principal of the college, and he was charmed by the deep religious nature of Sharat. And so he decided that he would teach him the Bible. So from the very start, Sharat, being brought up in an Orthodox Brahmin family, gained a further insight, a broader understanding in religious terms. Like many youngsters, he was attracted to Keshav Chandra Sen's Brahma Samaj movement, and he joined that. But of course, it was through that he saw the Keshav Chandra Sen had written in glowing terms about the life and personality of this saint induction, so called Sri Ramakrishna. He wrote in their magazine called the Indian Mirror. In the course of conversations, 3 people, him and his cousin Shashi, who also became Swami Ramakrishnananda, direct disciple of Ramakrishna, and another friend, they determined to go and visit the saint. And that happened in October 1883. And so they went to Dakshinaswar, and Sri Ramakrishna received them, as he always did, very cordially. But he realized the worth straight away. Ramakrishna, on immediately looking at a person, would understand them. They were like glass to him. He could see right through them, and he understood immediately all of their characteristics and saw them as his own. He made this comment: bricks and tiles, if burnt after the trademark has been stamped on them, retain these marks forever. But nowadays, parents marry their boys too young. By the time they finish their education, they're already fathers of children and have to run hither and thither in search of a job to maintain the family. That's a controversial statement to say amidst a group of people, because the next question that arose went like this: then, sir, is it wrong to marry? Is it against the will of God? So one of them in the audience asked this, and the master asked him to take a book down from the shelf. That book happened to be the Bible, imagine. And he opened it at 2 places. One place where Jesus told that some people are eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Others are eunuchs for other purposes. Some are born eunuchs. Some are made eunuchs, but others voluntarily decide to engage in celibacy. And then, of course, that's very unsatisfactory answer to the question. But the second statement was, again from the Bible, taken from St. Paul. And St. Paul, who was asked some similar questions, gave the answer. I say therefore to the unmarried, says St. Paul, and widows, it is good for them if they abide even as I, but if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And when this passage was read, the master remarked that marriage was the root of all bondage. Now we have to understand that when the master was speaking, he was directing his thoughts and words to select people. He would say different things to different people, as any good teacher would. Not contradictory statements, but whatever diet is suitable for the person. And so this was again challenging. And again, one from the audience interrupted him saying, do you mean to say, sir, that marriage is against the will of God? And how can his creation go on if people cease to marry? Because everybody has a father and mother. And the master smiled and said, don't worry about that. Those who like to marry are at perfect liberty to do so. But what I said just now was between ourselves. I say what I have got to say. You may take as much or as little of it as you like. But naturally, he was aiming for the young boys who he saw as inherent renunciants. And so it had its effect on Sharat. The stirring words of renunciation opened up a new vision that they haven't occurred to them before, and opened it up for Sharat and Shashi, who both became his disciples, monastic disciples. Both were charmed, of course, irresistibly by the personality of Sri Ramakrishna. Now, Sharat managed to go to Dakshinaswar every Thursdays when the college was not open. And so on every Thursday, he made it a rule to go and visit Dakshinaswar, unless something extremely important stood in the way. And of course, as he came more and more in touch with this remarkable, luminous personality of Sri Ramakrishna, he was more and more attracted toward him. And then he got caught up, of course, in this current of love, because all of them will say, nobody loved me more than the Master. Of course, the Master had seen the spiritual potential in Sharat from the very start. And on one occasion, a very unusual teacher, he got him to sit on his lap, and he said, I'm seeing how much, the other way around, I beg your pardon. He himself sat on Sharat's lap with this remark, I'm seeing how much weight you can carry. Now, this becomes very significant because in later life, how much weight he had to carry as a burden in his role of the secretary of the Ramakrishna Matan Mission. There's another aspect in association with the Master, because the discussion arose about Ganesha. The Master praised Ganesha a lot. He remarked on the integrity of the character and his utter absence of passion and single-minded devotion, or the absence, I should say, the detachment that he would have had. And young Sharat, he remarked, yes, well, sir, I like the character of Ganesha very much, he said. He is my chosen ideal. The Master had once corrected him, saying, no, Ganesha is not your ideal. Your ideal is Shiva. You possess Shiva attributes. Then he added, think of yourself always as Shiva and of me as Shakti. I am the ultimate repository of all your powers. A remarkable statement. Now, thinking about Swami Saradananda this morning, I thought that he was exactly as solid as a mountain. When we think of Shiva, we think of a mountain. Shiva in meditation, we find the mountain. And then, of course, Shiva dancing, we find the energetic aspect in the cosmos of the same entity, and how that Shiva is associated with the Shakti. And all of this comes to mind because Saradananda was immovable, just like a mountain, and yet very deep. But it was remarkable that the Master had this amazing insight. On another occasion, he said, how would you like to realize God? What divine visions would you like? What would you prefer in meditation? And Sharat very maturely replied, I don't want to see any particular forms of God in meditation. I want to see him as manifested in all creatures of the world. That is with eyes open. Wherever I look, I want to see him. That is knowledge. When you have that knowledge, then you see that entity everywhere. Of course, the Master said with a smile, that is the last word in spiritual attainment, and you cannot have it all at once. You have to work toward it step by step. But I won't be satisfied with anything short of that, replied the boy. I shall trudge on in the path of religious practice until that blessed state arrives. Now we see this remarkable work of literature that Swami Saradananda had made, and that is the biography of Ramakrishna. It came out of necessity because the magazine that Vivekananda had started, the Udbodhan, it was in trouble. Financially, it was in trouble. And Swami Turiyananda, who was involved, he had to go off to America. And so Swami Saradananda took over the burden of rescuing it. And so it is there even today. And this Udbodhan required a new office, where to get the funds. But not only that, but Holy Mother, that is Sharada Devi, also required a place to stay. In dire circumstances, he wanted to build something for her. And so he had the idea that the two can go together. He bought a house. That put him in great debt. And he vouched for it himself as a person. And if it wasn't for the fact that he had to raise funds, we wouldn't today have this Leela Prasang, this biography of Ramakrishna. He raised funds for it. And in doing so, gave us this, translated into English, The Great Master, in 2 volumes. Now, all of those various experiences described there, he indicated that he personally had experienced them. And so this was the worth, the great worth. Not only was it a biography of Sri Ramakrishna, but an expression of the spiritual attainment of the author. Sharat had met Naran. His friend was in trouble, and he met Naran, and Naran gave some kind of high-minded advice and so on. And Sharat was not impressed. He thought this young boy was very conceited. But Ramakrishna mentioned Naran and praised him to the hilt, said, "This is a boy you have to meet, you must meet." On the basis of that, he sought out this Naran. And what was his amazement? He discovered it was the same boy that he hadn't really thought much of previously. And then when he got to know him, the two became inseparable, to the extent that when Swami Vivekananda required assistance in the West, he called on Swami Saradananda. They were intimate friends, talking and walking throughout the night, well into the early hours of the morning, absent-mindedly going from one house to another, forgetting and walking back again. On one occasion, the Sharat had checked his time and saw, "Oh, it's time, I have to be at home. Won't you come in and have something to eat?" And so Naran agreed. And to Naran's surprise, he realized somehow he had been in this place before. He knew every corner, every room, every corridor. They became extremely close. In later years, of course, Swami Vivekananda, in his urgency to get things done, because he knew his life was fairly short, and so he didn't even take official charge of the order and the movement that he founded. He put Swami Brahmananda in charge. But because of the urgency of the work, he became and insisted on a high ideal of discipline, and he became very strict. And also, it didn't take much sometimes to trigger Swami Vivekananda's moods. But Swami Saradananda had such a high quality of even-mindedness that it was like a brick wall. Swami Vivekananda commented that Sharat, Maharaj Sharat, has the blood of a fish, cold-blooded. There's no reaction anywhere. Now, even when Sri Ramakrishna was ill, it was Sharat who dedicated his life to his service in the Kashipo Garden House. On the 1st of January, as we know, Kalpataru Day, Ramakrishna dispensed his grace by a touch and a look and transformed everybody. But Sharat and Latu had seen this because they were still doing some tasks as service to the master. And when they were asked later, "Why didn't you come down and get this master's grace?" his understanding was this: "I have every faith that the master will give everything I require whenever I want. Right here, right now. I don't have to go anywhere for it." This is a very key lesson for us because it is a lesson in faith. Such great faith was the key to his equilibrium and his composure. Charlotte passed his first arts examination in 1885. His father wanted him to read medicine, but he wasn't that keen because his father was a pharmacist. He had a pharmacy. But Charlotte had no aspiration to be a doctor. And on the advice of his close friend now, Narendranath, he joined the Calcutta Medical College. But destiny willed that Charlotte was not to be a medical man. When the master fell ill and he was removed to Kashipur, Charlotte, along with others, began to serve him there. Now, of course, Charlotte Chandra's father was alarmed at this development of this close association because he had in mind, you're going to be a doctor. And of course, as is the custom, the family had a family guru. And he, the father, thought, why is my son wasting his time, ignoring his studies and so on, by going to see this man? I'm sure our family guru, who is a very learned Pandit, when he meets Ramakrishna, my son will see what a superior guru our family guru is. And he'll leave off this Ramakrishna. And so with that in mind, this guru, Jagannath Talkalanka, went to Kashipur. And of course, the two engaged in a conversation. And naturally, it came to pass that this family guru, in a moment's talk with this adept, found that he was in the presence of a blazing fire. And secretly, he told Sharat's father, Girish, that his son should be considered blessed to have such a guru. And so for that reason, Sharat continued to serve the master steadfastly in his work. The first test of January 1886 was that Kalpataru day, where he preferred the service to the master than to get all the benefits of this remarkable day. One day, of course, the master, who already had formed the nucleus of his monastic movement, told these young boys to go out and beg their food. And all these boys came from high-class families. And when they knocked on doors, many people were surprised. They saw these people are well-fed. They're not poor. They're knocking on our doors. And many doors were slammed in their face. And so Swami Saradananda used to relate these stories with great relish. There was one place he entered into, a small village. He stood before the house uttering the name of God, and just as begging monks do. And hearing the call, an elderly lady came out. And of course, when she saw his strong physique, at once she cried out in great contempt, with such a robust health, are you not ashamed to live on alms? Why don't you become a tram conductor? At least that much. And saying this, she slammed the door in his face with a bang. But what do they learn? They learn humility. And they also learn the dependency life, dependency on God. There's an independence to it, but there's a dependence. Let me see. And then, of course, when the master passes away, they all go and assemble in Baranagore, in their first monastery, undergoing many, many hardships, taking their formal monastic vows, and forming a great bond of brotherhood in doing this. And living such great hardships, at some point, the natural tendency in early monastic life is, can I now test? That is, can I go with no baggage, no possessions, with just nature around me in all its various forms, and no understanding of what destiny has in mind for me. Simply knowing and having great faith that I will be fed and I'll be clothed, I'll be sheltered, I'll be looked after. off you go. An attitude like that. And so, naturally, all of them, apart from a few, departed to various places, pilgrimage places. He initially went to Puri, and then from Puri to Varanasi. But they all ended up in the foothills of the Himalayas, and somehow, from time to time, managed to meet each other, seemingly by accident, and sometimes traveling together, not knowing where food was going to come from, but living a beautiful life of austerity, prayer, and pilgrimage. Swami Saradananda had a very sweet but high-pitched voice. There's a funny incident in the Baranago monastery that when he read the Chandi or recited the hymns with his melodious voice, the bystanders were all spiritually uplifted, but at distance sounded like a woman, and somebody curiously went to see what is a woman doing in this monastery, and it was him, of course. So this longing for this life of wandering is there amongst all of them. And so for a number of years they wander like this, all of them. And it is worthwhile looking at in detail some of the great places that they wandered to. But on one occasion, you can see Saradananda's great compassion that climbing in the cold, mountainous conditions, and there an elderly lady struggling, and he takes his own walking stick and gives it to her. A small incident, but nonetheless showing the spontaneous, loving heart that this person had. Even going around Varanasi on foot as a pilgrimage, as many people do, caused many hardships. And the consequence sometimes in conditions like that, severe fever occurs and illness. And so eventually he returns to Baranago monastery in order to get better medical care and completely recovered. And then he started out for Holy Mother's native village of Jarambati. Later in life, he fulfilled as one of his last acts the building of the temple at the Holy Mother's place in Jarambati. He was extremely devoted to her, and at the Udbodhana office, where the office was downstairs and Mother's living quarters was upstairs, a household surrounded by noise and activity, hive of activity. It is to the great tribute to Swami Saradananda's concentration and patience that he managed to complete these volumes of Leela Prasang in the midst of all of this. And so, in the West, where he was called to assist Swami Vivekananda, he became one of the tutors at the Greenacre Conference of Comparative Religions. And at the close of the conference, he was then invited to lecture in Brooklyn, New York, Boston. Everywhere, his dignity of bearing, gentle courtesy, and the readiness to meet questions of all kinds was there. And so we find him as a spiritual guide. He afterwards settled down in New York to carry out the Vedanta movement in a regular and organized way. And as I say, then entered into his great burden of secretary. Several things noteworthy during that period. One I mentioned previously, Udbodhan building with raising funds, but giving us the master's biography. The second was in 1926 was a conference of all of those involved in the movement, of monks from everywhere in the world attending. And he gives a wonderful, inspiring message there, which is a lesson to everybody. He says that every new movement will immediately come across opposition. We should expect it. And then indifference, and then acceptance. And if you're patient enough to see through the opposition, then you'll get all the merits of that come through. But he cautions, beware, don't be complacent, because complacency will be your destruction. In this way, he tells us this. Now it's a great lesson for us, because I consider that the work we are doing here in Ireland and many other places, and all work throughout the whole world, really is of a pioneering type. A pioneering type because, as a movement, relatively speaking, it's a new movement. And it's a movement divinely inspired to match the times and the needs of the day. But to spread this message with missionary zeal, the same missionary zeal that was there amongst these 16 apostles, is necessary. When we look at the great energy that Vivekananda spent, spending his whole personal life energy, his whole life dedicating it, and all of them dedicating it. Here's my life, I give it, finished, for this remarkable cause to literally transform the entire modern world into a peace that passes all understanding. In August 1927, Swami Saradananda, as usual, sat in meditation in his room in the early morning. Generally, he would be meditating till past noon, because he was starting to wind down, and with various difficulties and sickness and so on, with all the work that he had, not only the official work that he had to do, but also the personal work, that is, being open to various counseling, consultations, looking after people's needs. On one occasion, he went for a walk on a regular basis. One of the monks was quite curious, "Where are you going?" He said, "No, you stay here." But he couldn't resist, so he went with him. And there the Swami went into a place, into a building, and there was a person dying of tuberculosis. And he was there caressing him, regardless of all the sputum that came out, accepting the food given, and with such love and such caring. The secretary of the Ramakrishna Math Mission doing this. And if the other monk had not been there, it would have gone. This would be a tale we couldn't tell. It would have been missing from the biography of the Swami. He was a living embodiment, as I said. I began this talk with a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita. So he was the living embodiment of the Gita in this modern age. To see him was to know how a man can be the Sthita Prajna, steadfast in wisdom, as taught by this Bhagavad Gita. He was alike in heat and cold and praise and blame. And his whole life was tuned to such a high pitch that he was beyond the reach of such things. In spite of all his activities, one could tangibly see that his was the case of a yogi whose happiness is within, whose relaxation is within, and whose light is within. He went and studied the tantric system and registers. I now see the Divine Mother manifested in all women, as his master had done. Once an attendant who felt the touch of his love so much that often he could dare to take liberty with him, asked him what he had attained spiritually. It's often a question that is asked, which we are traditionally want to shy away from. That's my personal business. But the Swami only replied, "Did we merely vegetate at Dakshinaswar?" At another time, quite inadvertently, he gave out to this attendant that whatever he had written in Sri Ramakrishna Leela Prasang about spiritual things, he had experienced directly in his own life. And in that book, he has, at places, delineated the highest experience of spiritual life. But with all his spiritual attainment, he was quite modern in his outlook too. And those who didn't believe or had no interest in religion would feel great joy in mixing with him as a very cultured man. He was in touch with all modern thoughts and movements. And this aspect of his life drew many to him who would afterwards be gradually struck by his spirituality. I started to mention how in 1927, a year after the conference or so, he sat unusually in meditation in his room early in the morning. Generally, he would be meditating till past noon, I mentioned. But that day he left meditation earlier and entered the shrine. He remained in the shrine for about 25 minutes, an unusually long period, and then returned to the door. Again he entered, stood for a few moments near the portrait of Holy Mother, and returned. And this he did several times. And this reminds us of what Swami Vivekananda himself did, going in a kind of consultation into the inner shrine and coming out. And when he finally came out, a great serenity shone through his face. He followed his other routines of the day as usual. In the evening, when the usual service was going on in the shrine, he remained absorbed in thought in his own room. But after that, an attendant came with some papers. And as the Swami stood up to put them inside a chest of drawers, he felt a little uneasy. His head reeled, as it were, and he asked the attendant to prepare some medicine and instructed him to keep the news secret, lest it should create unnecessary alarm. But those were his last words. And he lay down on the bed, and it was a case of apoplexy, and he passed away 2:00 in the morning, 19th of August. So this is a brief synopsis of the great life taken and read partially from this book assembled by Swami Gambirananda. And now we come to some of his teachings. We can probably highlight 18 key teachings that he was emphasizing. And I shall try to make a summary of these. It's the easiest spiritual practice to do is japa, repetition, loving repetition of God's name. All of the disciples mention it. Holy Mother mentions it. Of course, Sri Ramakrishna himself mentions it. But to repeat the Lord's name and to worship him, there's no special time or place is required. That's the advantage of it. And in whatever condition one may be, we can always take his name. The Holy Mother went a little further in this regard. She said, if you have nothing to do, do japa. I once met somebody who was a great businessman in the manufacturing sector. And sometimes he would see workers just standing. And he said, what are you doing? And they said, we're waiting for this. He said, waiting is not an activity, and gave them something to do. But sometimes we have nothing much to do. That is, we might be also waiting for something. We might be waiting in a doctor's surgery. We may be waiting for a call. And this is the time where we can be doing japa. If we drive a car and we're caught in traffic and we can't move, then we can at least be doing japa. And then selfless work. Like all the disciples, he mentions the value of selfless work. Selfless work makes the mind purified. Knowledge is the very nature of the self, but being covered with ignorance, it's not manifest. The object of selfless work is to remove this ignorance. And then, of course, first attain knowledge. After attain knowledge, then we can see the whole world in its true condition. And it doesn't matter what approach you take, you'll come to the same conclusion. You have faith in the words of your Guru, have faith in the Lord, have faith in Scripture, All of this is necessary. And when we pray, we absolutely should pray for all, because everybody requires some improvement. Everybody, they're saying the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement. Everybody is born with a certain understanding that a drive to perfection is necessary, which means there are many blemishes that we have to remove. The master, he said, would compare the mind to a packet of mustard seeds. If the packet is once untied, the seeds get scattered in all directions. How difficult it is to collect them again. Some are perhaps lost forever, but absolute faith makes the impossible possible. I repeat that again as a wonderful statement. Absolute faith makes the impossible possible. You can gather all the seeds up. And it strikes me that one of the key notes of his life really was this faith. Faith in himself, faith in his master, and faith that all things will be well. I always remember that great statement from St. Julian of Norwich: all will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Then whatever work stands in the way of God realization, he says, that is, whatever activities stand in the way and increases discontent is bad work, we should give it up and do something else. You should wholly discard it. Sometimes we get asked, is this a good thing to do? Should I be doing this job? Should I be doing that? Should I be in the company of this person or that person? All kinds of questions, similar questions like this are being asked. And the answer is exactly like that. Discard anything that is stopping you from this movement toward your own freedom. All souls are free, and that is why all minds ever hanker for freedom, he says. A true leader is he who never hampers that craving for attaining freedom. I might add, in any circumstances, his only concern being to see to it that when the person concerned gets liberty, he doesn't misuse it. We have to be honest enough to think that even in religion, sometimes religious doctrine and dogma also hampers us. Sometimes ritual hampers us. Sometimes superstition hampers us. And this we have to ruthlessly get rid of, because it's stopping our road to freedom. Anything that is constricting, anything that is binding. Brahman and Brahman's power are non-different, like fire in its power of combustion. The scriptures speak of this Brahman as the cosmic person, Virat, and the power associated with him as the mother of the universe. That is why the presiding deity of Gayatri is sometimes spoken of as the cosmic person and sometimes as the mother of the universe. And that is why there's no contradiction in imagining either way. Some people give us an alternative. It's either this or this. But Ramakrishna is very clear, because these are essentially the teachings of Ramakrishna. It's quite clear. You can have God with form and God without form. And if you believe in God without form, don't think that there's no God with form, and vice versa. One of the key lessons that Mahendranath, the author of the Gospel of Ramakrishna, says in his opening meeting with the master. And then he gets a number of shocks as blows to his ego. See? Then another teaching, he says, you complain that thoughts of duties sometimes intrude when you sit for meditation. All minds are in the same predicament. You cannot escape this, even if you leave work and retire to a forest. But if through God's grace it becomes firmly impressed on your mind that the world is impermanent, and if the idea that God alone is your true goal takes a grip on your heart, then this kind of unsteadiness of the mind will be greatly eliminated. To have a strong longing for God and feel ill at ease just because God has not been realized, are, however, dependent on His grace. Pray to him for this with all earnestness. You need, so it goes on like that, but we have reached 9 o'clock now, so we leave it there. I recommend, if you want further insight into those teachings, then Swami Gambhirananda's book, The Apostles of Sri Ramakrishna, now probably published as Disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, and assembled by and compiled and edited by Swami Gambhirananda, who was at one point General Secretary and then also President. He was the 11th President of the Ramakrishna Matan Mission. So I hope that these few insights taken from this book have served to inspire us whenever we listen to and study the life and approaches and the internal wiring of great holy people, saints and sages, and see the example that they have of their saintliness. It will inspire us to do the same and imitate them. And we too then will inquire, as Arjuna inquired from Krishna, what is that who is characterized as steady wisdom? And how does that person look? How do they walk? How do they speak? What is their key? What is the spirit, their approach? How is it that we have a different approach? And how can we get the same approach? And I hope this talk has given you some clues. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.